Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Every once in a while, you read something about a star long since forgotten, and you wonder, how do we not know more about this guy? Well, Monte Pearson is one of those guys, a fixture in the New York Yankees rotation of the late 1930s. Pearson's mark in the World Series is actually incredible. And next on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look back at the career of a World Series star for the New York Yankees, whom so many of us have never heard of.
This is
Monte
Sports Forgotten
Pearson.
Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 111, Monte Pearson. Like I said in my tease, every once in a while, you read something about a star long since forgotten, and you wonder, how do we not know more about this guy? Well, one of the organizations that I am a member of, SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, is a wonderful organization, and I encourage anyone listening to this podcast who is a baseball fan, a sports fan, and who is not a member of SABR to visit SABR.org, that's SABR.org, and join. The bioproject that SABR has is nothing less than phenomenal. Literally, thousands of biographies on major league players. Every week, a newsletter is published, and in it, there is a list of new biographies published. A few times a year, SABR publishes the Baseball Research Journal, a treasure trove of statistical analyses, in-depth biographies, and more. Now, no, this is not a commercial for SABR. Rather, just information for my fellow baseball fans. In a recent newsletter, there was a link to a new bio by Dan Schoenholz about Monte Pearson. Now, Pearson's regular season record over the course of his 10-year career is good, not spectacular. He spent his first 4 years with the Cleveland Indians going 36-31, with his best season being, at least in wins, 18-13 in 1934. His last season in baseball was with the Cincinnati Reds in 1941, where he appeared in 7 games, started 4, and he went 1-3. But in between, he spent 5 years with the New York Yankees. Those were actually some pretty darn good years. Over the course of those 5 years, he went 63-27. His best mark coming in 1936 when he went 19-7. But it was Pearson's stats in the World Series that really caught my attention. The Yankees won the World Series in 1936, 37, 38, and 1939. In 1936, the Yankees beat the New York Giants in 6 games. In 1937, they took out the Giants in 5 games. In 1938, they swept the Cubs, and in 1939, they swept the Reds. In each of those series, Pearson started one game, and his numbers in those games are ridiculous. 4 games started. He completed 3 of those 4 games, and the one game he didn't complete, he pitched 8 2/3 innings. So, out of a possible 36 innings, he pitched 35 2/3 innings. He went 4-0 with a 1.01 ERA, and his game against the Reds in 1939 was a 2-hit shutout. Absolutely remarkable. And Pearson's story is quite interesting, even his post-career life. And I'm going to talk about all of it with Dan Schoenholz. Before we get there, however, a little house cleaning. Sports Forgotten Heroes is a member of the Sports History Network. This is a wonderful network of podcasts, all concentrating on different aspects of sports history. Check it out at sportshistorynetwork.com. So much there for you to enjoy. Of course, I encourage everyone to check out my website for this podcast, sportsfh.com. Here is where you can learn more about the stars me and my guests talk about. I have links to stats and footage of each star as well. You can also click on the Ask a Question link to see forgotten stars whom I will be discussing in the near future, and you can submit a question here as well. Have some fun and participate. Remember, that's sportsfh.com. You can also follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. On Facebook, just look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page, and look for Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram as well. Also, if you think about it, please let all of your family and friends know about Sports Forgotten Heroes as well. I'm sure there's content here everyone will enjoy. And as always, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a 5-star rating, and if you can, write a small review. As always, thanks for listening. Your support is greatly appreciated and does not go unnoticed. Okay, let's get into today's show with Dan Schoenholz about the terrific career of pitcher Monte Pearson. Dan, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. I am thrilled you agreed to join me today.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. I'm actually also really excited and looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Well, we have to start with this, Dan. Where did your interest in Monte Pearson come from, and how did you discover him?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long story. I work for a city, the city of Fremont in the Bay Area in California. And years ago, one of my colleagues who knew I was a baseball fan informed me that she had run across a guy in town who was a former major leaguer, and his name was Emil Malo, not a household name at all.
No.
He turned out to be a guy who had played for many, many years in the Pacific Coast League and had just come up briefly in the major leagues. In fact, he only got 1 hit in his career. But anyway, I connected with him. I met him. I really liked him. At that point, he was in his 90s. He was one of the oldest living major league ball players. And so I got very interested in him, and I researched his life and career for the Society of American Baseball Research, SABR, bioproject, where people research and write biographies of people who've played Major League Baseball. And in the course of researching Emil Malo's life, I got very interested in some of the players and managers that he had interacted with in his career, one of whom was Monte Pearson, who was his teammate on the Oakland Oaks in the early 1930s. And so when I, ran across Monte Pearson's name, looked him up, I was interested to find out not only that he'd had really kind of a very interesting career and successful career in a lot of ways with the Yankees, but I also learned that he had been a student at UC Berkeley, which is my alma mater. So that kind of sealed the deal. And I decided I was going to research his life and career as well.
And quite an interesting life. And before we get into the details about his career and his phenomenal, and I mean phenomenal, track record in the World Series, tell us a little bit more about Monte Pearson. Where did he come from? What was his background?
Yeah, so Monte Pearson was born in either 1908 or 1909, depending on the sources that you trust. He was born in the Bay Area, but then his parents moved to Utah when he was a baby, and his father was killed when he was just, when he was still a baby, basically. Monty's father was killed in a mining accident. And he and his mother and 3 siblings then came back to California. His mom remarried, and they settled in the Fresno area in California's Central Valley. And so he grew up in Fresno and grew up playing baseball, and ended up playing both high school baseball and then playing in something called the Twilight League, which was a sort of a semi-pro league in Fresno. And Monty was originally a catcher and a third baseman. He was a good hitter. He had a great arm, though, and eventually one of his coaches converted him to a pitcher. And that's when he was discovered by a local scout and was signed to a minor league contract.
And he had a decent minor league career. He bounced around a little, but his big days in the minors were with those Oakland Oaks of the PCL, which, by some accounts, people say was almost like a second major league. The talent was that good. So tell us about his minor league career, if you can, and how he was finally discovered and by whom.
Yeah, so he was discovered by a local scout who was connected with the Oaks, and so he recommended him for the Oaks to sign. They signed him. They were affiliated. The Oaks were, as you said, part of the Pacific Coast League, which was then considered essentially the third major league because of the talent level. And many of the teams had affiliations with other minor league teams in the lower minors. And so he was originally sort of farmed out to a club in Arizona, where he pitched for part of 1 year while he's sort of getting some seasoning, and then came back to the Oaks in 1930 and stuck with them and pitched the full season with the Oaks in 1930, I believe. I should actually double check that. It may have been 1931. Mm-hmm. But once he stuck with the Oaks, he was recognized as a very talented, up and coming young pitcher. The Oaks were actually kind of a mediocre club in the Pacific Coast League, even though they had a fair amount of major league talent. Probably the biggest star on the team when Monty came up was their catcher, a guy named Ernie Lombardi, who went on to great major league success and is now a Hall of Famer. And he also comes up again in Monte Pearson's story. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, Monty pitched it for the Oaks. He had a good couple of seasons, and it was pretty clear that he was major league material. There was a lot of speculation in the local press that he'd be going up any time, and the sports writers were sort of making predictions about which team would sign him and for how much he would be sold. Ultimately, it was the Cleveland Indians who won the bidding for him and purchased him for $35,000 from the Oakland Oaks.
Mm-hmm. Well, what kind of pitcher was Monte? Did he throw fastballs, off-speed stuff? Tell us about the kind of pitcher he was.
Yeah, from what I've been able to discover, he was actually kind of a fireballer in the minor leagues and when he first came up in the major leagues. But when you hear Monte Pearson now described, or you read about his kind of World Series success and his years with the Yankees, he's described as a curveballer, sort of a master of the soft stuff. So I think, he when he came up, he had a great fastball. He had some control issues. I think he was trying to get a handle on controlling the curveball. And then sort of as he aged and maybe his fastball slowed down a bit, he really became a curveball specialist and a good one.
Well, in 1931, as you said, with Oakland, he went 17-16, was signed by Cleveland, but he got off to a rocky start with the Indians. He didn't last long, did he? Tell us about his the term cup of coffee, his first go-round with the Indians.
Yeah, so, in his first major league appearance, he came into sort of a blowout game against Detroit. He had a good first inning, escaped unscathed, but then in his second inning of work, he got sort of raked over the coals and gave up several runs. And, finally, his manager sort of took mercy on him and yanked him, took him out. He although he was on the club for a couple of months, he only had 5 or 6 appearances. He had an ERA over 10. He wasn't quite ready. And the Indians recognized that, sent him back down to their top farm team, which was the Toledo Mud Hens. And while he was there, the manager was a former major league catcher, a guy named Steve O'Neill. And he was really good working with pitchers. And he sort of helped Pearson start to get better control of his curveball and worked with him. And the rest of the year he spent in Toledo. He had not a very good record, 1-loss record, but his ERA, I think, was under 4 for the rest of the season at Toledo, which at that time was a pretty good ERA. And I think Cleveland was looking at him as, a talented guy that they'd bring back in 1933.
And they did, and he had a pretty good first full year with the Indians. He went 10-5, and he led the American League with a 2.33 ERA. And he was off and running. His manager at the time was Walter Johnson, and Johnson had nothing but the highest of praise for him. How impressed was Johnson with Pearson?
Yeah, so you got that exactly right. Walter Johnson was named manager mid-season in 1933. Pearson had started the year in Toledo and had dominated there. So it was only a matter of time before he got called up. And when Johnson was hired, he took over for a guy named Roger Peckinpah, who had been the Cleveland manager to start the season. When Johnson took over, his first personnel move was to bring up Pearson to the big club. And he didn't regret it. Pearson had an outstanding rookie year, as you mentioned. He won 10 games in, about a half a season. His ERA, as you mentioned, was 2.33. He won the ERA crown as a rookie. And I think, for those listening, many may know, but many might not know that in the early 1930s, baseball was really a hitter's game. And hitting stats were sort of inflated compared to what they are today in terms of batting average and run scoring. And it was a combination of small ballparks and just rules that basically favored the hitters. And so for a rookie to come in and to dominate in the way that Pearson did was almost unheard of. And his ERA of 2.33 was outstanding. And according to some of the advanced metrics, his 1933 season was the second best by any pitcher in the entire decade, behind only Lefty. Yes, and I know, behind only Lefty Grove's 1931 season, where he won more than 30 games. So it was quite a debut by Pearson, and it had Johnson and the Indians predicting big things for him.
Well, he spent that part of that 33 season with the Indians, going 10-5 with that great ERA, and he was there for 34 and 35. So really, just over 2.5 years with the Indians. He went 36 and 31, including an 18-win season in 1934. But you might say he just wasn't that overwhelming, at least not to them. He didn't reach his potential. Something just wasn't there.
Yeah, definitely he did not dominate the next couple of years in the way that he had in his rookie year. And he did win 18 games, as you mentioned, in 1934. And he was decent. I would say he was sort of an average starting pitcher in the American League in 34. And then in 35, he was a bit worse and started to have some injury problems. And what you started to read in the contemporary accounts in 1934 and 1935 were these doubts that people started to raise. First, they were just here and there, and then they were sort of more, they were more present, more widely seen in newspaper articles, questioning his toughness, questioning when he was injured, whether he really was injured or whether he was just soft, questioning how much he cared. And so he really started to get a reputation of being sort of a person who was very talented, but wasn't a winner.
Yeah, it's funny, Dan. I recently did a podcast about Howard Emke, and many thought Emke lost concentration on occasion, and that contributed to his not reaching his full potential. Sort of sounds the same as, with Pearson. Some said he lacked competitive spirit. Very interesting, really good parallel there. So the Indians, they sort of gave up on him and they let him go. They traded him to the Yankees. Why didn't they stick with him any longer? Were you able to figure out any of that?
Well, I mean, I think, part of it was that I think, some in the organization felt that he wasn't likely to, kind of live up to his talent level. So I think that was part of it. I think also, though, the guy that the Yankees offered up in trade, a guy named Johnny Allen, was quite a talented pitcher himself. And the Indians gave up not only Pearson, but also another pitcher, a guy named Steve Sundra.
And that's the guy the Yankees really wanted, right? Was Sundra.
Yeah, it's interesting, given how their relative, how their careers turned out, Sundra and Pearson. But at the time, Jacob Ruppert, who was the owner of the Yankees, after the trade had been made, and I think it was actually a year or two later, maybe after Pearson had shown that he had a lot of value, Ruppert, in an interview, indicated that actually when they made the trade, their number one target was Thundra, and they had thought that Allen was a better pitcher than Pearson, but they thought that if they could get Thundra in the deal, it would be a good deal for them. So it was kind of interesting confession on the part of the owner.
Yeah, I mean, Sundra, he had a marginal career at best. He pitched 9 years, went 56-41. His best year was 1939, when he went 11-1 with a 2.76 ERA for the Yankees. But the throw-in, Monte Pearson, he wound up being the jewel of the trade for the Yankees. By the way, I looked it up. Johnny Allen went 20-10 his first year with the Indians, 15-1 his second, and 14-8 his third. So the Indians did pretty well in that trade as well. It's not as if the Yankees didn't give up good talent to get Sundra and to get Pearson. I'm just not so sure, and you already mentioned about Colonel Rupert, that the Yankees realized just how good Pearson was. He got off to a great start with them. Talk about how his attitude might have changed and the type of pitcher he became. I mean, he went 19-7 with a 3.71 ERA, and he wasn't that shabby at the plate either. You said he started his career in the minors as a hitter, and with the Yankees that first year he had 253 and had 20 RBI. But tell us about the change of scenery for Monte Pearson, going from Cleveland to the Yankees and stepping into that rotation. How competitive did he become? How did the change of scenery help him?
Yeah, well, Pearson showed or stated that he was very excited to go to the Yankees, and it made sense partly because the Yankees, even though they hadn't won the pennant in 3 years, they'd last won the pennant in 1932, but they were a contending team, and at that time players were not particularly well compensated, and making it to the World Series or winning the World Series greatly increased, the player's earning potential. And so Pearson, when he was asked how he felt about the trade, one of the things he said was, well, I'm super happy because I'm in this to make money, and my earning potential just went up. So, that might have been part of what motivated him and got him, sort of in the right frame of mind to pitch well. Also, he was going to a club with a really good defense. He was going to a club with great offense. He's going to a ballpark that was, had short porches down the line, but had big center field and power alleys. So, that stood to help him. So, he was definitely positive about the trade. He went to the Yankees. They immediately inserted him into the starting rotation. He was the third starter behind two Hall of Famers, Red Ruffing and Lefty Gomez. And he quickly, demonstrated his value. He pitched well. He got off to a good start. He had sort of a pattern in most of his career. He got off to good starts early, sometimes faded, sometimes kept it going. And he was sort of true to that pattern in 1936. He got off to a good start. He made the All-Star team. And in 36, he kept it going the full year, and he won 19 games. And as you mentioned, he had a good year at the plate. He hit about 250 and drove in 20 runs. So all in all, it was just a very, very successful first year for Pearson.
Yeah, and this is where I think the Monte Pearson story gets really interesting. So bear with me for a second.
Sure.
I mean, when you consider the roster of great pitchers to have appeared in the World Series for the New York Yankees, the list reads like a who's who of baseball. Whitey Ford, Lefty Gomez, Red Ruffing, Roger Clemens, Mariano Rivera, Ron Guidry. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And the one name I bet very few recognize is that of Monte Pearson. And his record in the 4 games he pitched, one in each year, his first year with the Yankees, 36, then 37, 38, and 39. I mean, his record can't be any better than it is. He went 4-0. He pitched 3 complete games. The one game he didn't finish was in 1938 when he pitched 8 2/3 innings. I mean, listen to these numbers. Winning percentage, 1,000. His whip, 729. His ERA, 1.01. So, I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. And his first one came in 1936, Game 3, Yankees against the New York Giants, and he beats Carl Hubble 5-2, striking out 7, walking 2, complete game. I mean, I just might have given the answers, but is there anything in particular that stands out? I mean, some thought he wouldn't even take the mound because of a late season injury.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the really fun parts about researching Pearson's career and life was learning about his performances in the World Series and sort of, each one sort of had its own character. Each game that he pitched each year had its own character and its own story, and it was very interesting. The 1936 game in particular, I found intriguing. It was his first World Series start. He was pitching against Carl Hubble, who had that year finished the season with 16 consecutive wins.
Wow.
And then, in the midst of the longest regular season winning streak in baseball history, he continued it into 1937 by winning his first 8 decisions in 37. So altogether, he won 24 regular season decisions in a row. He had won 16 to close out the season, the 1936 season. He'd also won Game 1 of the World Series against the Yankees, and he had started obviously for the Giants and beaten the Yanks. In Games 2 and 3, the Yankees had won, so the Yanks had a 2-1 lead. Pearson did not pitch Game 3 because right at the end of the season, as was often the case with Pearson, he was injured. He had an injury, back problem that popped up right at the end of the season, and there was a lot of speculation that he wouldn't pitch at all in the World Series. That turned out to be incorrect. His back problem abated enough for him to start Game 4. But he was facing Hubble, who was coming back on, I think, 3 days rest. There'd been a rain out, so there was a little extra time in there. And, the Giants, I think, were favored, although I think the Yanks were still favored to win the World Series. I think in that game, Hubble appeared to be unbeatable. But the Yankees got to him. Before I talk about the game, the other thing that was really interesting about Game 3 of the 36 World Series was that one of the spectators at the game was a very well-known baseball writer, a guy named Arnold Hanno. And Arnold Hanno wrote a famous baseball book called A Day in the Bleachers, which is about his day in the bleachers at the 1951 World Series, or I'm sorry, the 1954 World Series, where he witnessed Willie Mays making one of the greatest catches ever made, one of the most famous defensive plays ever made, on Vic Wirtz of the Indians, where he caught a ball with his back to the plate about several 400 and some feet from home plate. He tracked down this incredible shot off the bat of Vic Wirtz. Anyway, Arnold Hanna is famous for his description of that game, And I have that book and happened to look at it while I was researching Monte Pearson's life. And amazingly, at the beginning of the book, he makes reference to the fact that his first World Series game had been in 1936, Game 3, when he'd gone to, or Game 4, when he'd gone to, to Yankee Stadium to see Carl Hubble take on the Yankees. And, he was a big Giants fan, Arnold Hanna was, and was crushed when Pearson beat him. But the other amazing thing about Hanna is that he's still alive. He's 99 years old.
Wow.
And he's still active, in sort of baseball circles. And through the Society of American Baseball Research, I was able to track him down, and I was able to call him and interview him about this game. And it was a big thrill for me.
Sure.
And it was just amazing, his recall of this game that had occurred 84 years prior. And so, yeah, I mean, pretty amazing. So the Yankees got off to an early lead. They scored 3 runs early, and 2 of those runs were on a Lou Gehrig homer. And that homer landed only a few feet from where Arnold Hanna, the 14-year-old Arnold Hanna, was sitting in the bleachers, enjoying the game. Although he didn't enjoy that part of it because he was a big Giants fan. So anyway, the Yanks got off to a good lead. The Giants couldn't do anything with Pearson, and as Hanna noted, Pearson was throwing soft stuff by that time. So that's what Arnold Hanna remembered from the bleachers. That he could see that it was curveball after curveball, and the Giants just couldn't connect. They did manage to score a couple of runs, but by then the Yankees were ahead. I think they had I think they were ahead 5-0. They may have. I don't remember exactly the order of the scoring, but basically, they had a comfortable lead, and were never really able to solve Pearson. And he threw a complete game, and the Yankees won 5-2. And one of the other kind of fun things about it is that Pearson also got 2 hits against the great Carl Hubble in that game. So not only did he outpitch him, but he also solved him as a hitter.
Wow, very cool. Very cool stuff. This is why I do this podcast. I love to hear these kinds of stories. Very cool stuff. Let's move on. 1937, somewhat of a typical year for Monte Pearson. He suffers through many injuries. Does he have the drive? Does he have the competitive spirit? It's all brought back into question. He goes 9-3. Tell us about 37.
Yeah, so 37, Pearson, he hurt his ankle in spring training, and that sort of set the tone for the year. He came back in time to start the regular season and got off to a pretty good start, but in May, he was diagnosed with a torn muscle, and that sidelined him for a month. He came back in June, but his arm never really got right, and he was used sort of sparingly. So he ended up, as you mentioned, winning 9 games that year. He had a good ERA, 3.17, so an excellent ERA in that era. But again, it wasn't clear whether he'd be starting or not in the World Series. Ultimately, though, again, he got a Game 3 start. It was again, the 1937 series was again a Subway Series in New York, the Yankees against the Giants. So kind of a repeat of the 36 Classic. This time, the Yankees won Game 1 and 2 behind their 2 Hall of Famers, Gomez and Red Ruffing. And then Pearson started Game 3. And once again, he pitched lights out. The Yankees, again, put a bunch of runs on the board. They led 5-0 by the time the Giants even got a base runner. And the Giants did score a run in the seventh, but Pearson cruised, and then in the ninth he sort of tired, and the Yankees were able to load the bases against him. So with 2 outs, manager Joe McCarthy, another Hall of Famer, pulled Pearson, and Johnny Murphy, who was the Yankees relief ace at the time, came in and got the final out for the save.
It's the one game that he didn't complete. He only went 8 2/3 innings. I mean, out of 36 possible innings, he pitched 35 2/3. He, over those 4 World Series games, it's crazy stuff. 1938, he did pitch a full season, got off to a slow start, but he went 16-7 with a 3.97 ERA, and he caught fire midway through the season, and the highlight came on August the 27th against his former team, the Cleveland Indians, in the nightcap of a doubleheader. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so as you said, Pearson got off to a slow start, kind of unusual for him, but then he did start to pitch really well. He caught fire. He ended up winning 10 consecutive games kind of in the middle of the summer. And the final game of that 10-game win streak was on August 27th. It was the nightcap of a doubleheader at Yankee Stadium against Cleveland. And he was pitching on only 2 days rest because the Yankees had this brutal schedule that had several doubleheaders in the space of a week. And so he could only get 2 days rest. But that didn't appear to faze him. He was perfect through the first 3 innings. He walked a couple guys in the 4th inning, but then he struck out a guy named Jeff Heath. He then got a ground out from Earl Averill, who was one of the Cleveland sluggers, and then struck out a guy named Hal Trotsky. He was a big power hitter for Cleveland.
Yeah, we did a podcast on Hal.
What's that?
I did a podcast on Hal. He was
wow.
If not for Lou Gehrig, he might have been a much better known ball player. He was a good ball player.
He was a good ball player. Yeah. So that ended Monty's hopes for a perfect game, but for the next 4 innings, he was perfect again. And the Yankees, meanwhile, were pounding the ball as they tended to do in those years. They were they scored 13 runs in that game, so Pearson didn't have to worry too much about losing. He just had to worry about trying to keep his no-hitter going. So he went into the ninth. He'd not given up a hit. To that point at Yankee Stadium, nobody had ever thrown a no-hitter there. The stadium had opened in the early 20s and still had not been christened with a no-hitter. So the crowd was really into it. If you read the accounts of that game, it sounds like people were, riding on every pitch, a lot of suspense. Pearson got the first batter, a guy named Frankie Pitlack. I'm sorry. The first hitter, he got the first hitter, pinch hitter, a guy named Moose Solters. He struck out on 3 pitches. The next batter was the catcher for the Indians, a guy named Frankie Pitlack. And he hit a slow ground ball that looked like he might beat it out. But Joe Gordon, the Yankee second baseman, made a great play on it and threw him out. And so the last hope for the Indians was a guy named Bruce Campbell. And he made good contact, lined the ball, but it was straight to George Selkirk, the Yankees outfielder. And Pearson had his no-hitter, the first ever in Yankee Stadium history.
Wow. Cool. Again, cool stuff. But, injuries again pop up, and there were reports that he might not pitch in the World Series, the 1938 World Series against the Chicago Cubs. What was it this time, and did he pitch?
Yeah. So, this time, he had he had an arm problem. It wasn't very well defined or described in the newspapers, but it was sort of some problem with his arm threatened his ability to start in the 38 series. So again, it was, uncertain what was going to happen. And as it happened every year, basically, he recovered in time and made his start. And again, he was starting in Game 3, and he pitched as well or better than he had in his previous 2 World Series starts. He gave up 5 hits, threw a complete game, 5-2 win. One of those runs was unearned. And he earned the respect of the Cubs player manager, Gabby Hartnett, another Hall of Famer, who basically said that Pearson showed us more than any other pitcher. And, he was basically wondering, where he got his stuff. He said he'd seen good curveball pitchers, but really nobody who compared to Monte Pearson. And that the Yankees had won the first 2 games, so they went up 3-0 and they completed their World Series sweep the next day.
Yeah, he pitched another complete game, gave up 5 hits, an earned run, struck out 9, walked 2. I mean, when it comes to the World Series, you cannot question the competitive spirit of Monte Pearson. But you know what? In 1939, he got off to a slow start, and that's exactly what happened. People were accusing him of no competitive spirit. How fair or unfair was that assessment?
Yeah, Warren, it's really difficult to say. After all these years, you read this in the paper, there definitely were a lot of sort of allegations, and there was a lot of theorizing going on. And sometimes you say, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. There wouldn't be this much sort of, discussion about his attitude if it wasn't true. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that, back in the 30s and 40s, when people got hurt, they were expected to, play through it and, risk their health and their careers, for the team. And I think, there were some players at that time who basically, when they were injured, they knew they were injured. They knew they couldn't help the team, given the physical difficulties they were facing. And they kind of didn't buy into the idea that it was good for everybody to play through the injury and, basically go out there at less than full strength. And I can't tell you what, which of those was the truth at that time. Maybe it was a little of both. But certainly Pearson showed that when he was healthy and when he was focused, he was as good as anybody.
Well, his ERA in that 1939 season wasn't all that good. It was a 4.49, but he did go 12-5. I mean, the Yankees had one heck of a team. But you know what? He was given another start in the World Series, this time against the Cincinnati Reds, and you can't question the competitive spirit in that game. That start might have been the best of all his World Series performances, and this is where Ernie Lombardi comes into play, his former teammate with Oakland in the PCL. Tell us about that game against the Cincinnati Reds.
Yeah, absolutely, Warren. The 1939 Yankees were a juggernaut. This was a team that was making their 4th straight trip to the World Series, and many, baseball pundits rank it as the greatest team of all time. And certainly those who don't call it the greatest recognize it as one of the greatest. And Pearson, although he was hurt much of the year and didn't have a great regular season, when it came to World Series time, Joe McCarthy again, demonstrated his confidence in Pearson by giving him the ball. This time it was in Game 2, entrusting the game to him. Pearson, pitched an amazing game. There were almost 60,000 folks at Yankee Stadium. Game 1 had been a close one. The Yankees had pulled it out. It was a late run, winning 2-1. But the Yankees hadn't dominated that game. They needed this one. And Pearson was facing the guy who was a National League MVP, a guy named Bucky Walters, who'd won 27 games and had a 2.29 ERA, so more than 2 runs lower than Pearson's. But in this game, Pearson outdueled him. The Yankees kind of cobbled together for a 4-0 lead. Pearson was perfect through 3 innings. He walked a guy named Billy Werber, who was then caught stealing in the 4th. Then he threw 3 more perfect innings. So by the 8th inning, he'd given up only 1 walk. The Yankees were ahead 4-0, and the crowd was starting to sense that they were seeing something special. The fans were on the edge of their seat. They were oohing and aahing with every pitch. The first batter was a good hitter, a guy named Frank McCormick, outfielder for the Reds, and he made good contact, flied out deep to left, but the ball was caught. And Pearson now had 7 1/3 no-hit innings, which tied the World Series record at that time. It's been set by another Yankee, a guy named Herb Pennock, in 1927. So the next batter was Pearson's old battery mate, Ernie Lombardi. And, they knew each other well. That hadn't helped Ernie in his first 2 at-bats. But this time he connected. He managed a clean single over second base, a line drive. So, the air went out of the stadium briefly. But then Pearson, basically got back to work and got the next 2 outs. And then in the 9th, he got the first 2 outs, gave up a harmless single with 2 outs, and then got the 3rd out. So he finished with a 2-hit shutout. And at that point, one of the greatest World Series pitching performances of all time.
It was a 2-hitter, wins 4-0 in his 4 World Series appearances, like we said, 3 complete games, 1 game. He goes 8 2/3 innings. He's 4-0 in the World Series with a 1.01 ERA. His winning percentage is perfect. He pitches this 2-hit 4-0 shutout. And to me, the most amazing thing about it is after the game, instead of celebrating how great Pearson was, some writers took pot shots at him, saying he never realized his potential. How crazy is that?
Yeah, it was crazy, and it shows sort of how deeply ingrained that narrative was with the sports writers. They bought into it, and when he would pitch a great game in the World Series, as he did every year, that was sort of the response. The refrain was, this sort of proves our point that he's too good to have the results that he's been getting in the regular season each year. It wasn't fair, but that if you read the contemporary accounts, you'll see that that kind of line of thinking quite often.
Well, 1940 wound up being his final year with the Yankees. He went 7-5, and it ended with a significant injury after starting the year healthy for the first time while with the Yankees. it started off really well. And then he has this awesome 13-inning complete game against the Indians. What happened afterwards?
Yeah, so it is. It's kind of ironic, as you mentioned, Warren. It was sort of the first year where, in quite a while, where he'd been completely healthy in the spring, having a good year. He made the All-Star team. And then in the middle of the summer, he squared off against Bob Feller. And in that game, as you mentioned, it was a 13-inning complete game, and he beat Bob Feller 4-3. But in the process, he tore a ligament in his shoulder. And that was basically it for him for the season. And as it turned out, really for his career.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately he was traded to Cincinnati. He just wasn't the same pitcher after that injury. What were those final few years like for Monty, trying to hang on, playing in the PCL, and ultimately failing to make it back? What were those final baseball years like for Monty? I mean, it's not like he was really old. He was only 32 that final year with the Reds when he went 1-3 and, then had to try to claw his way back.
Yeah, I think Pearson thought he could come back again. He'd had arm problems before, and I think only he knew how serious those had been. But I think he felt that the ligament damage, was surmountable, and that he could do what he'd done several times before, come back from an injury. And so after the season, 1940. The Yankees did not win the American League pennant for the first time in several years, and they did sort of a rebuild. They cleaned house a little bit, and Pearson was one of the people that they sent off. The Cincinnati Reds, who had almost been no-hit by him in the 1939 World Series, knew how well he could pitch, and I think probably because he'd been injured before and come back, thought that, he'd be able to recover again. And so they traded for him. But in 1941, he only threw about 25 innings for the Reds. And then, his arm never was right. He didn't perform well. It was clear he was still suffering from the injury. And the Reds gave up on him, sold him to Hollywood in the Pacific Coast League, and he wasn't able to pitch for them other than one kind of token appearance, and then he shut it down for the 41 season as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, when I read your bio about Monte Pearson, Dan, it was such well, first of all, kudos to you. What a great bio. And, you read about Monty's career and how he rose to the occasion in the World Series. But his career sort of had a sad finish to it. And then you read about his post-baseball career. I mean, really sad. He boxed a little, went to Cal Berkeley, participated in city sports-related activities, and then the scandal, which ultimately ended with his son being a jailer of his. Tell us about the scandal. What happened? And man, what a sad end.
Yeah. So after Pearson retired in 1942, he's a smart guy, but he had not attended college. He'd gone straight into organized ball after high school. And so he decided to go back and get his degree. He went to UC Berkeley in the mid-1940s, and he got a degree in public health. And after he got his degree, he was hired by the city of Fresno as they called him a sanitarian, basically a public health official. And he was very well known in the area, obviously, because of his athletic success. And he appeared to really love the limelight. And at that point, when he was working for the county as a sanitarian, he was, he was very much in the public eye. He was speaking to civic groups regularly. He was a musician as well. He was a talented guitar player, and he would do musical performances. He was the director of the Fresno Bee, the newspaper in Fresno, sponsored an annual summer baseball camp for local kids. And he was the director of that for several years. So he was very kind of visible, very active, and I think very well loved in the community. He also ran for public office in 1952. He ran for county supervisor and made it to the sort of the November election. He made it through the primary, but he ultimately lost that election. But he was still serving as a public health official, and again was sort of a public figure in the area. And then, as you mentioned, the bombshell kind of hit in 1962. He was indicted for having demanded bribes from septic tank contractors. He had the authority to approve the installation of septic tanks, that it was being done correctly. And the allegation was that, he was taking bribes in order, and then approving installations that had been done incorrectly that were a threat to the public health. And so he was tried, and he was found guilty of one felony bribery count and sentenced to jail time plus probation. And when I did the biography, I tracked down Pearson's granddaughter, his oldest granddaughter, a really wonderful woman named Tammy Alexander, and I interviewed her, and she, told me that her dad, who was Pearson's oldest son, Wesley Pearson, he'd just become a deputy sheriff at the time of Pearson's conviction. And so when Pearson was sentenced to jail time, Wesley was one of his jailers.
Oh, awful.
Pretty crazy.
Awful.
Yeah.
Gosh, wow. That's not the way you want the story to end, but unfortunately, that's the way it does end. And when we take a look back at the life and the career of Monte Pearson, how should he be remembered? I think we can say there might be two different legacies, a terrific baseball legacy and a sad personal life legacy. What do you think?
Well, I don't know if the story really ends with his conviction. That was, in the early 60s. He petitioned to have his probation terminated and his conviction set aside, and he was successful. And it was I couldn't find a lot of detail around, what convinced the court to set aside his conviction. But it seemed to me that there was another side to the story, or that in retrospect, maybe some additional information had come out. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But he did get some semblance of, sort of closure and, sort of a decision that went in his favor. So, I'll just put that out there. I'm not sure exactly, what it says about his guilt or lack thereof. And then also, he didn't disappear after his conviction. I mean, he was, still around in Fresno and still fairly visible for 15 or so years afterwards, until he died in 1978. So he was elected to the Fresno Athletic Hall of Fame in 1967, and was, recognized in the press for, again, for his athletic career. And the focus really was on his career, not on his conviction at that point. And then one of the things I included in the bio, because I thought it was very cool, was a quote from Ted Williams. And Ted Williams in 1970 was asked what he thought about a rookie pitcher at that time, a guy named Burt Blyleven, who went on to a Hall of Fame pitching career. And at that time, he was a rookie, though. And Williams basically said, he's very smooth. He reminds me of Monte Pearson.
Oh,
Monte
very
Pearson.
cool.
Monte Pearson was one hell of a pitcher, and everything he did was smooth. So anyway, to have Ted Williams kind of recognize you for your pitching ability, I think that's quite a testimony. So anyway, Pearson did work in real estate a bit, as in the 70s when he was later in life. But then toward the end of the decade, his health began to fail, and he passed away from cancer at age 69 in January of 1978. And as he said, his obituaries really did sort of talk about two things, really kind of the great World Series exploits, but also the fact that his second career ended in sort of a fall from grace when he was convicted. Mm-hmm. So it's an incredibly interesting story. He was a very interesting person to research. He left behind at least one really wonderful family member who I had the opportunity to speak with. I think definitely his career and life were worthy of being remembered, just because they were so eventful.
Absolutely. I love doing stories like this. Guys who did something great on the field. That's what this is about. It's about what they did on the field. Monte Pearson, just a name that gets lost, and it shouldn't be. I mean, he won 100 games, had 94 complete games, and, arguably one of the greatest records in the history of the World Series. You really can't do much more than what he did. 4 games, 4 wins, a 1.01 ERA, missed by 1 out from throwing 4 complete games. What a career for Monte Pearson. Dan, I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Are you working on any other bios?
I'm taking a little break, but I am planning to, to do some more. I find them very enjoyable, and, I always learn a lot. So I'm looking forward to doing more in the future.
Well, Dan, again, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. You've been a great guest.
Warren, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed kind of sharing what I learned in all my research, and I hope that your audience also enjoys learning about this very interesting and talented pitcher for the Yankees, Monte Pearson.
Absolutely. Good stuff. In April 2017, I launched Sports Forgotten Heroes with the intention of talking about stars from the games we love to watch from all sports. Never did I think that more than 4 years later, I would still be doing this. At first, I had hoped someone would discover my little podcast, and I was shocked to see that about 36 people listened to that first podcast about Billy Cannon. Well, here I am, almost 4.5 years later, and more than 800 downloads every 2-week period. I think that's pretty good considering I don't have a marketing budget. All I can do is post notes about the podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and hope for the best. Word of mouth is always great too. Like I said, I've been doing this for almost 4.5 years, and I do everything from hosting to writing, researching, finding my guests, and all of the editing. Sports Forgotten Heroes has come a long way, and now, after 4.5 years, it's time to take a break. So, I would like to thank all of my loyal followers and listeners for all of your support. While I am stepping back for a bit, I will be back. So stay tuned. And again, thank you for listening to Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.